this presentation, I am also sharing the slide deck. Welcome, everybody. We're really excited for you to be joining the Q3 Support Partner Meeting on September 26, 2024. Reading over the HILT purpose and vision. We're to be a network of health providers all throughout Seattle, Snohomish, and Pierce County to come together to help improve access to a skilled workforce. In addition, we have equity and diversity as one of our tenets. And so we want that to be part of the set of the guiding principles across all HILT engagements and committees. So thank you very much for being here. My name is James Ramirez. I'm a HILT convener along with my partner, Abby Taft. And so we're going to help lead some of these conversations, but we're really here to kind of ask the questions. And so this meeting is your meeting. This is your meeting to help kind of identify some of those priority areas that were discussed in the last meeting. And so really we're going to share and discuss a trauma-informed approach in the workplace. We're going to discuss what others are witnessing in the workplace, what you're seeing, what you've seen in the past. And it's really an important discussion to have now, especially in this time, because there's a lot of contributing factors. And of course, learn strategies to support a trauma-informed approach. So lots of different efforts and work is being happening in this space. I recently saw this, and you may have seen this as well. It's from the U.S. Surgeon General. Mental health is the defining public health crisis of our time. And so when we look at that, there's a lot of different contributors to that. Why do you think this is the defining public health crisis? I'll point out COVID. I think COVID has a lot of impacts. What other things are you seeing that you think that this is the defining public crisis of our time? All right, so Betsy put social media and device proliferation. Yeah, man, you see a lot of things happening not only with middle school and high school, but also even in elementary school. Man, students go to school with phones and they have access to lots of information and that pressure of social media. Does anyone agree? Politics? Wow, you mentioned the P word.
Sorry, couldn't avoid it.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
And are you wanting people to primarily put their responses in chat, or can we just?
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think mental health has been a largely ignored area of our just in general individuals' health and community health. And I think it's because of the pandemic and the workforce crisis, I think it's just really erupted as a really major issue because it's largely been ignored, and there's so much stigma associated with dealing with mental health issues. Having been a mental health practitioner as well as experiencing some of my own mental health issues over the last 68 years, maybe that's TMI, but there's some reality to that. And so I just think, if you work in this business and you get exposed to trauma at anywhere along the healthcare continuum, you're going to deal with some mental health issues. It's just reality, part of being in the business.
Yeah, Dan, you said something really important about it being ignored. And it's interesting because whenever I've talked to people, some people always say, why is it a big issue now? Or why is it now that and it's funny that some people don't have the historical context that it's always been, and they've just been kind of once removed from that need. Yeah, Herman, I see your hand up.
Well, I wanted to contribute here only because I'm wondering about the mental health stressors that will be a result of the Boeing strike, right? We have 30,000 plus Boeing employees that are currently on strike, 17,000 just in the Snohomish County, Everett area. We recently sent out a survey to all our supply chain suppliers, and what we're seeing is that there's going to be furloughs, and there already are furloughs. There's going to be layoffs, and typically these things have ripple effects, not just the people that are immediately working in these organizations, but their families, their kids going to school, they carry some of these elements with them, right? And so, that job insecurity piece, I'm just kind of worried about how we're addressing the mental health aspect of that, right? Going through these tough times, right? Strike creates economic insecurities, and then you start seeing all these other things come into play as a result of that. So I'm kind of bracing for something like that, but trying to figure out the best way to be responsive to that as well. If that
Yeah,
makes
good point.
sense, I just wanted to contribute that. So
No, it's really relevant of what's going on right now. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, when we think of bullying, it impacts so many areas. So it's such an impactful thing that's happening. Yeah, Keith.
I'm doing the two-part thing. I called in on my cell phone because the audio on my laptop is not the best, so you may see me fumbling with two devices. I wanted to go back to what I thought I heard Dan say. As you know, James, here at SJI, we make it very clear that we meet our colleagues where they are. And a lot of us have shared some traumatic experiences we've had with previous employers. And as much as we know, when we have a fresh start with a new employer or a new place to live or anything like that, we tend to take some of that baggage with us. And so, as a person that has been working on his own mental health conditions for the past few years, and I've been fortunate enough to have the resources to sort of seek professional help to mitigate some of the fallout from my healthcare, my mental health conditions. What I appreciate about it is that there are certain things now that I notice in the workplace and that I noticed in with my colleagues. I'm by no means a physician. I'm not diagnosing anyone. However, there are certain patterns that show up and they look different to me now than they did before I started getting the care that I get from my mental health professionals. So I'm saying that to say working for an organization like ours, when we work in a field where we're sort of exposed to some of the less than fortunate aspects of our society, we have to be very careful with managing our own health and doing what we can to support that of our colleagues. We want to make and I want to know everyone else's perspective on this. And it's something that we're sort of learning as we go. We are noticing that folks are more productive when you allow them to sort of stand tall in whatever they know about their mental health condition and utilize whichever strategies, healthy strategies and tactics in order to manage their energy and manage their moods very well. I think sometimes there remains a disconnect between the vision and the belief of our leaders in our organization and how that actually shows up when we're doing the work. And so I want to ask, has anyone encountered a scenario or a moment where you're trying to reconcile being aware of people's lived experiences and how they may be triggered in the workplace and how that may affect productivity? And what type of messaging and coaching are we doing around that?
Keith, you kind of surmised much of this presentation. So I think all that work. So I think those are going to be great comments for people to add on. But if anybody has an initial thought for Keith, I think these things will kind of, be injected a little bit in the presentation, but definitely something important to bring up. So thank you, Keith. Anyone have a good response or addition to add to Keith?
I can pop in. So I'm new to WOBS and I'm leaving an organization, higher education institution from back east. And I definitely left for a lot of the reasons that were covered in this presentation, the trauma-informed presentation that was given, I think 2 weeks ago now. So there's one specific situation that really stands out to me. I was a manager. I had 4 direct reports, and one of my direct reports was transitioning. They were changing their pronouns to they, them. They were going through a name change, and the university's systems were just not set up appropriately to handle that. So there was a circumstance where we thought everything was changed. We thought their new name was represented in the way it should be, and it wasn't. The account kept switching back, and their dead name kept showing up, and it was a real problem for my direct report to come to work and not know whether or not they were going to be blasted with their dead name, and pronouns that no longer reflected how they wanted to show up at work. And that really impacted their productivity. And, you know, something that I navigated as a manager in that situation, they were embarrassed. They felt shame. They didn't know how to show up at work. They didn't know how to talk to me as their manager about what they were going through and why their productivity was slipping. And as a manager, I didn't have support from my manager. Nobody was able to help me through that situation. So I approached my direct report from my humanity, right? I was like, you share with me what you want to share with me, but I need you to know that do what you need to do. And I ended up coaching them through taking a leave of absence from the university until they could finish their legal name change and, you know, do what they needed to do for themselves. So the everyday experience of coming to work and being triggered by that wasn't gonna, you know, keep them in that poor place, that poor mental health place. So all of that to say, that's a very concrete example when I think about how we can infuse trauma-informed practices in our workplace. Like as a manager, if I had approached that situation differently, if I had told my direct report, I still need you to perform, or don't talk to me about what's going on in your life, I think that would have had a very negative impact on this person. And I can tell you that my manager at the time was not supportive of any of that, and I wound up going directly to HR, the university's HR, and trying to work with them to support this direct report and shelter them from my boss at the time. So all of that to say, I think a lot of it is trickle down, and falls to managers who may not be supported by leadership and other things. So anyway, that's my anecdote that I think resonates with a lot of what Keith was just sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Karina. Elizabeth, I see your. Mhm.
I think it's also, you know, it's how do you balance it as a manager? And the pressure to get things done, the pressure to support your employees, whether or not you're being supported by your management. And, you know, whether or not you really feel that you're in a position to be that mental health counselor.
Mm.
You know, is that now part of the role of a manager? And I'll just mention this, James, I didn't bring a presentation or anything, but James had asked me if there was anything that we were doing that might factor into this. And we actually included a class in our integrated healthcare management on trauma-informed management. And it's taught by faculty in our social and human services division because that's where they come from. And I've already talked with them about, you know, maybe incorporating some of what was presented at the last HILT meeting, but maybe to come and talk about that class and why we decided to do that. But thinking about if in management programs, this is a bachelor's degree in management programs, if we're truly training the leaders of tomorrow, we do need to give them the tools. And I think the other tool that we really need to give them is, where's the boundary and how do you set it? And I think that's the hardest thing, particularly in healthcare, because we all come from, it's our job to help. Whether we're now in education, whether we're now in management. And so, you know, setting those boundaries to protect your own mental health can be really tough.
Yeah, no, thank you, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was mentioning that class, which is just really, really important right now. And it's how is this the first time y'all are including that class, or has it been already, you know, for a few years? Or
Well, our integrated healthcare management BAS started in we've put through two, we're on our third cohort. So
Okay.
one graduating class and our second year cohort now have been through the class. I don't teach the class, but I can potentially look at going back and surveying some of our students. It's a small group to begin with, but to see, or the faculty to see what kind of feedback they got on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Yeah, such important information. And Keith did put the question into the group chat as well. If you have a response, or as it comes in through the presentation, if you want to respond to Keith's question, feel free to. Keith, I was just going to have you maybe, read it, and if anybody had any questions on it.
So essentially what I was getting at, with organizations pushing for us to be more cognizant of our colleagues' lived experiences and traumatized histories, how do we reconcile this very important principle with concurrent calls to be the most productive you can be, to get the job done anyway? We may not use that last phraseology, and that's the ultimate point.
Yeah, so how do you balance all those things?
Right.
To be support person, as Liz said, we're not the
Yep.
counselor per se. So how do you kind of bring that into the fold of that support as a manager, but yet trying to get the job done, just like you're talking? Fantastic. Really appreciate this question, and we'll kind of keep coming back to this question, I think, because it's going to be important as we kind of continue on. So lots of good information. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. And we're going to move forward a little bit just to start kind of getting into the presentation a bit. And I think as the presentation unfolds, I think some of these questions will have some highlighted answers that were presented in that discussion. So as we know, it was a trauma-informed approach to the workplace by Patricia McGuire, who works for Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. So we were really thankful for that presentation. And when we started is we're going to start with what are you grateful for in this moment? And if you want to include that in the group chat. I don't know, one of the other things that Abby and I were talking about is kind of resources, right? And one of the resources that I was introduced to last year was a documentary called Stutz. And it's Jonah Hill interviewing his psychiatrist is basically the whole premise of this movie. One of the tactics that Stutz talks about is appreciation. And he talks about it in terms of, we all have that dark cloud above us, right? And the dark cloud is everything that is negative that we self-talk. When we look in the mirror and we have a negative comment about ourselves, or we're there in a conversation and we go, oh man, that was a dumb comment, or, to ourselves. And so it's all that negative talk. And he was talking about how the way to shorten that and the way to, drive through that is through appreciation and being appreciative. So we're going to start today of what are you appreciative of right now? What's your appreciation? And go ahead and include that into the group chat. I think that's really important. And for me, today, I'm appreciative of my dog. My dog, hangs out with me, and I take him for a walk, or he takes me for a walk. And those are the things that really kind of help center me in my day. And now that we're getting into the rainy season, I'm a little bit kind of wondering, right? So yeah, what are you appreciative today? So go ahead and include that into the group chat, or if you want to come off and just say it out loud, feel free. Abby said my kitten for keeping me company while feeling under the weather. I agree. Yeah, pets provide a lot of good support with that. So keep those comments going. We'll refer back to them, in this part here. And so we will look for more responses in that. The session objectives was defining trauma, describe how trauma might show up in the workplace, and then sharing frameworks that could support some of this engagement here. Keith said the ability to pause, ensure I'm not interpreting the world through filters resulting from traumatized experience, and makes for healthier ways to handle everyday life. Yeah, really, really important. Herman said, I appreciate having the opportunity to support my daughter in her cross-country competitions. Wow. So Herman is running. Good luck, Herman, man. So the definition of trauma, and this is the way it was defined in that presentation: an event, series, or events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. When we look at this, I think there was a statistic that was, I want to say 66% of people, experience some traumatic experience in their lifetime. This also relates to ACEs. If you're familiar with ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences, there's a lot of research, at prominent universities that have dived deeper into trauma and just what that looks like. So lots of good information and resources is definitely there. Elizabeth put, my husband for being the family chef. Man, Elizabeth, you are lucky. I only say that very, very envious that you eat gourmet meals is what I'm envisioning.
Well, I don't know if they're gourmet. He likes to experiment, but I tell you, I wouldn't eat nearly as well if I had to do it myself.
Dan put his granddaughter in Walla Walla. So not only does he have a helicopter that shoots him from one area to the next, but he even gets a chance to see his granddaughter from time to time. How old is your grandkid, Dan?
She's she'll be 3 in February. And so,
Aw.
yeah.
Cute.
And I got to read her a book today, introduce her to tennis yesterday. Thank you very much.
Wow. Starting them young.
Oh, yeah.
So the brain and toxic stress, and this was something that was coming up quite a bit. These are normal automatic bodily responses when we get stress. We get angry, anxiety, body aches. You can see kind of the list here. And these are to external stimuluses, right? So another example would be that physical response that is normal. So when we go to the doctor, for instance, and they give you a shot unexpectedly, or even when they give you a shot, many times you physically will flinch, right? That's that kind of physical part. That physical is a positive response to external stimulus. What happens when people go through trauma is they start tying that physical part to the external stimulus. So now they get a lot more excitement sometimes in that external stimulus. It's not just the positive part. Now it kind of elevates depending on that trauma. When we look at those abnormal experiences, once again, you see ACEs here, but you kind of see all these different parts of abnormal experiences, right? Sometimes they call it, first thought wrong. And sometimes they just blurt out something very, because they're really kind of energized with that event. And really, when you look at the physiology of that, you can see that, normally in a fast pathway, it kind of happens and it all goes through that process through the front cortex, the amygdala and so forth. But in a trauma response, it kind of surpasses that and just goes very quickly. So a lot of times, once again, there's that blurting out or that kind of reaction that can happen at times. This is not for every person who has trauma or doing it, but it's just sometimes those are some of the reactions that kind of happen with that. And you can just see the differences between the abnormal and the normal. What do people think about this list? Do they agree with that? I mean, it's kind of a little bit more physiology in this example here. Here are the normal experiences. What are people's thoughts? Do you think this is accurate?
Well, I can really identify with the brain fog thing.
Okay. Yes, that's right. Thank you.
And I think I appreciate that, Liz. And I think what we often underestimate when it comes to mental health issues and treating things like depression, anxiety, is the power of the brain to both naturally fight it, but also if you if certain synapses get reinforced in terms of responding to difficult situations, it becomes kind of like a deep canyon, a river. And so that becomes kind of the normal response. Again, I worked in childhood trauma for 25 years or so. And so how I coped, how I responded, how, I reacted to certain situations, they become almost the routine because our of the physiological responses that are reinforced by the emotional responses. How's that for getting really technical?
No, that was good, Dan. Man, you really nailed that on. Thank you. Any other comments about this slide?
I think the journey for me was pinpointing the origin of having these experiences, and I originally didn't tie it to the right thing. So it was almost as if I was addressing things with this understanding that it originated from something else, and it ultimately ended up being some of my mental health conditions. And so when I was able to sort of label it and correctly tie it to its origin, I was better able to manage it. One thing that I thought I heard Dan say too, and I promise Dan, I'm not just you know fanboying over here or anything like that. The sort of I don't know if you all experience this. You know that maybe if you have some sort of trigger or you experience something that's unfavorable, and it's almost as if you reflexively respond to it, and you sometimes understand intellectually that it's inappropriate or it may not be right or the power may be off, and somehow you still end up doing it anyway. It was reframing that as a habit that I need to break because it was almost on autopilot, and doing the pause, right? And knowing that I should do the pause and knowing that this feeling and this response is originating from something that may not necessarily be related to what's happening right now. So for me, taking that journey took a while to sort of pinpoint the origin of the feeling so I can better address it instead of doing it on autopilot. Doing it because it's familiar and not necessarily doing it because it's efficacious. That's the thing that took a lot of work, in my opinion. So,
Wow, Keith, you've done a lot of work. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. No, I commend you for that work. I'm not trying to be fanboy either. I'm just saying that takes a lot. Yeah. Any more comments on this slide? So I think just as Keith was talking about that response time, right, where people just kind of respond a little faster than maybe they had time to kind of process it in their head a little bit. And that's, I think, the physiology that we're showing here. I'm just going to go revert back to the appreciation. I just want to read Angie Graves. Angie, you said, I appreciate having the scheduled time with our HILT partners to discuss critical issues and create further connections. Aw, and also my two cats. So thank you, Angie. That's really nice. Amy said, also my dog, she keeps me company when I can't fall back to sleep. Once again, thankful for pets. And Herman said, well, oh, watching, not running. Okay. So really good appreciative statements there. When we look at kind of those trauma behavior responses, right? You have the fight, flight, freeze, submit, and you can kind of see the different examples here. And it's really which one do we navigate more closely to? And every person's going to react differently. So if they fight, there's that quick part and they're lashing out, and there's that kind of aggressive kind of response if you see it. In the flight part, right? They just kind of get disconnected and they can't quite, be present. In the freezing part, still that brain fog that we were kind of talking about, that anxiety and kind of feeling that internal heartbeat kind of increase, or else they just, submit, right? They go into just kind of give up or kind of whatever, and just kind of feel that kind of victim kind of action, if you will. So any other examples in these trauma behavioral responses? Have you seen anything out in the field? Anything that you're more, witnessing that's happening? I mean, do you see it more in submission or fighting or, flight or freeze? I do have a friend that has a history of trauma growing up. His mother had a disabling disease and actually passed away when he was a senior in high school. And so his whole existence is just his mother being sick, kind of mother being sick, and so there's that part. And I will say that his trauma response is submitting, just being very like just kind of, okay, and just I'm not going to engage. I'm just, whatever you want to do, like just kind of, 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 just kind just kind of gives up, and it's an interesting response. So I do see that in people, when that stress kind of goes up, then are they able to talk about it, or they just kind of give up in some examples. So I do have people that do that. Any other examples that you've seen?
I'm not sure if it's an example, but as I'm looking at this, and I appreciate seeing this because I was not at the quarterly meeting, James. I recently did some work basically it was some training around resiliency, and a lot of this really looks very similar. People who are able to address, and control their responses have a tendency to be more resilient and, able to, positively get through adversities and things like that, and or help support other people on their team, for example, if they're leaders, get through tough situations, whether it's with colleagues or personal situations or whatever that mental health, stress might be. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't know if anybody has done, work on resiliency at all, but as I'm looking at these, it's really reminding me a lot of that work. So anyway, curious what others think or how that might tie into this.
Yeah, resiliency work. That's pretty powerful. And there is a slide that talks about resiliency and kind of how to keep building that up. So I think that's really relevant with here. So thank you.
And James, I was just gonna say that, I hadn't really seen too much on the fight spectrum. I've seen some of the other flight, freeze, or submit, but at least, around with colleagues in the workplace, that type of thing. But I guess, coming from the college setting, maybe you have experienced this as well, that I have seen some of the fighting behaviors among students, right? And faculty reporting that. And, I was in a position where I had to dig it in a little deeper. And typically it always was something to the effect of somebody going through a major life changing event of some sort. A divorce in their they themselves or in their family, loss of their home, things like that. So I did see that with students to some degree.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're exactly right, especially as they're maturing through that emotional, growth and intelligence for themselves. So students, yeah, when they come up and things don't always work out the way they think, and how do they deal with that? I will, Abby put in a question: how would one tell the difference between freeze and submit, or can they go hand in hand? Any thoughts on that question?
I'll take a stab at Abby's question. How would one tell the difference between freeze and submit? I've seen freeze show up in the workplace, especially with that last bullet, difficulty with planning and goal setting. I had an experience with a direct report a while back where we were going through some setting SMART goals for partnership expansion. And because of a traumatic experience in an area that was closely related to where the previous employee was, there's a lot of reticence to engage in partnership work in that area. And so the argument was we could set the goal. However, if we don't meet the goal, I don't want to be punished for it. And so a little digging kind of revealed the solution to that is we can set the goal, just ensure that there are a lot of support structures in place, ensure that the individual knows if they find a spot where they can't figure out the way forward, that they can come to you and ask for help without being chastised or punished or belittled, which was some of the previous work experiences. I've seen it show up and I've seen free show up that way. Submit a whatever attitude. In another setting, a direct report was adamant about having something done in a way that that person wanted it to be done. That individual just couldn't see it unfolding any other way. And so what I learned in that situation was it wasn't necessarily dismissive or whatever. It was more of, I don't know, and I can't see a way forward. You are the so-called boss. You say that it's so let's just do it anyway. And what I realized, it was more of me finding a different way to articulate the ask and tell it and present it in a way that was a lot more receptive. Now, that took a lot more work, and we were able to get there. So I don't know if my examples clearly articulated the difference that you were seeking, Abby, or that you had in mind.
No, that's definitely helpful, Keith. And like, it's just something I just think about sometimes because I don't often hear submit a lot of times. And it's like, I've just always heard like those top three. And so when I just read them side to side, I'm like, huh, like, I wonder if like, to your point, like when you're working with others, like how you'd be able to kind of tell the difference. And so, so that is helpful, just like getting down to the specifics of like really getting in there and like really just figuring out of like, you know, where these people are coming from essentially. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think these are examples of these four areas. And I would say that a person, doesn't just stay in one area. They can be in a submission, mentality, and then all of a sudden something happens and they want to lash out and be like, hey, then you know what I mean? So I think they go into multiple, and it just doesn't always stay in one particular area. And I think you're exactly right, Abby. I mean, how do you really differentiate between the two? So I think these are good examples to kind of start witnessing what's happening to other people and trying to pick up some of those cues on what could be going through their head and their minds. That's kind of looking at trauma from the definition, looking at examples, what that behavior might come up, looking at that physiology, and now, cultivating a trauma-informed workplace. So, and I think this goes in line with what Keith's question was as well. It's just, how do we start, looking at it from an organizational perspective, trying to obviously meet the organizational goals, mission, vision, and values, yet trying to be sensitive to our employees and teams. And so how do you balance that out? And I think that's a really important question, Keith. So, as people kind of come on, thinking about that balance. So here's a resilience rainbow, and this was something that Angie kind of brought up, the word resilience. And what this looks at is these are just different areas, not necessarily correlated to one. And what we mean is that, from a community area, here are the different areas that a community could be supportive to support resilience. Affordable physical and mental health care, living wages. You can see the list here. This is from a community, perspective. That's someone who's wanting to become, safe within themselves. These are the things that their community could offer so that they feel supported from their community. So you see safe neighborhoods, quality schools. These are the things that promote safety from a community perspective. When you look at the organizational, here are the things from an organizational, right? Growth environment, collective problem solving, transparent communication, and calming spaces. We see calming spaces again, and I just want to highlight that because we've seen that in a lot of different areas, not only for here in resilience and also trauma, but also in just personal needs for employees. Just, we look at that healthcare environment that can be very stressful, and sometimes people just need a calming space to go, calm down a little bit because lots of things are happening. So what are those areas from an organizational perspective that are going to support a person to feel a little bit, more supported and safe? So, and we kind of keep bringing up this safe word, right? And what does that mean? But we'll get right to that. But from a personal level, it's positive and open mindset, calm the brain, physical activity, and build your community. So from a personal level, here are the tactics and things that can support that from an organizational level and a community level. And all the while, all these things are really honing down on the person to feel, safety, from that psychological feeling valued. And so how are you going to do that? It's going to happen when you're having these three different influences in your life and connecting with those organizations or people in that way. Yeah, Elizabeth or Liz.
Yeah, just looking at the safety, and I was thinking, because I was at the other presentation, but coming back to something that Dan said, and I know being from a descendant of very British parents, the whole thing around stigma, and that's a safety issue, is it safe for me to even share anything? And I'm not quite sure how we deal with that. And I'm not sure how it fits in with some of these other things, but a lot of people simply will not say anything because you just don't. Mental health is not something that you talk about.
Mm.
And hence the Pink Floyd song Comfortably Numb.
Leave it to Dan to bring it home. I do think that
Leave it
Elizabeth
to Dan to
spoke
bring up Pink Floyd.
up.
In my teenage years, we would have our little marijuana play Pink Floyd at 78 RPM, and you could see all kinds of things.
Oh my gosh.
Don't anybody share.
Feeling safe.
Talking about
Feeling
building
safe.
resilience right there. So I do want to comment on that though, Elizabeth, because I think I mean over the years, right? I think we've seen such a shift in this, and even just being able to have conversations about it and having meetings like this and talking about it and all the work that's been done to figure it out and make, and a lot of employers, you know, and schools, I know, you know, in some situations that I've been, you know, actively involved in that are trying to do their best to make it safe to talk about it and make things a little bit more of a norm in understanding that, yes, we all deal with these issues and what are they and how can we get through them and how can we support each other and, you know, build each other up as we feel like we're breaking down on the inside. So I feel, or at least I've seen, that it's way different than it used to be. Yes, I think there's still, you know, some areas or maybe even some places that still have that kind of old school, you know, you don't want to talk about it because you don't, you know, you're afraid of repercussions or things like that. But I do think that it has improved a lot. Do we still have a lot of, you know, we've got a lot of room, right, still, but to me, I just like watching this evolve over time. I'm pretty happy with where we are compared to where we used to be. And, you know, obviously it's our job to continue to help it evolve to get even better.
And I'd agree with that, Angie. I do know that I see that it's definitely a cultural thing, and I use my own culture as an example. But we have a lot of students who are from Asian backgrounds. We have a lot of students that are from Eastern European backgrounds, and that stigma still exists, and it's still really, really strong. And so, you know, sometimes the issues come from, you know, even trying to help. You know, there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you break down that I'm not trying to pry, I'm trying to get you to where you need to be, kind of thing. So
Totally makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that's a good call out, right? Like just because we've been working on it here doesn't mean, you know, we can fall into our you know, assumptions, you know, and sometimes forget, to your point, that, you know, just because we've been working on it in our institutions or whatever it might be, doesn't mean that someone else is going to come into that with the same viewpoint and the same, you know, ability and freedom, frankly, to feel like they can, you know, speak their mind or talk about what's happening. So, yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah,
James, I really appreciate this. Sorry.
No, go right ahead.
I really appreciate this graphic because I think resilience is cumulative, just as trauma is cumulative. And so as we think about individual, you know, this reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy. But as we think about extending it beyond the self to organizational community, it's so important to kind of see that get built out and to see kind of the building out the kind of the resilience factors, and we used to call it in I'm trying to think of the correct term, but risk factors and protective factors, and this whole list is kind of under the guise of those protective factors. So really building resilience and building a strong foundation of protective factors individually as well as in your community is so important.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you, Dan. The only part I was going to say is that, when we look at all three, one of the comments that was brought in by the presenter was talking about, when communities and organizations are low on resiliency factors, it undermines any personal resilience. So, when we're talking with employees, meaning if they're feeling, they're trying to feel safer themselves, but they're personally, trying to do a positive mindset. But let's say they're working at a place that they don't really align with in values and vision and mission, or they're working in a place that's toxic for them. But in their community is maybe on the positive side. All these three things, kind of the more alignment that they have, will contribute to the person feeling safe. So many times, it's with the community, the groups, the people that you're with, your friends. I mean, all those things play a part in the person's developing that safe feeling. Another example would be someone who maybe is in school and maybe being harassed at school. Then there's that organization, but yet, what community do they have to fall back on to support that personal development? And I wanted to highlight these things for the organization as well, just because I know Keith brought in a really good part about that leadership. But, if a person is in an organization to support resiliency, it's with that growth environment, right? So what are those opportunities for growth? It's not just stagnant. We're not just do what I say what I do kind of organization, but really trying to include the person in that growth. Collective problem solving. When I look at this, it reminds me of that, people, everybody really, I would say, but more particularly those who have experienced trauma, in order to feel safe, you have to give them control. And they don't have to have all control, but they have to have control of some of the discussion, some of the creation of SMART goals, as Keith was kind of bringing out. So what's that collective problem solving rather than, me as the supervisor, I say, hey, you had this problem. Here's the solution. This is the way we're going to do it. Like, that's it. And so that kind of communication brings more angst many times. And that is not that transparent communication, I think, which is part of this as well. And obviously that calming space. And there's a good example in one of the slides about calming spaces, just kind of taking a step back and going, hey, I see we're getting worked up. Maybe we just need to take 10 and, acknowledging that part so people can kind of gather their thoughts a little bit. Any other more comments on this slide?
I did have just one more comment because I know, Andy, you kind of brought up that this has been getting it sounds like brought up in other areas about resilience. And I really like this. It is definitely reminding me of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but this is essentially just trying to, I guess, maybe redefine what resilience means and really kind of take it off maybe just the old school individualistic side of self-care, right? I think like when COVID happened, everybody kind of had time essentially. I mean, maybe definitely not people in the working in the hospitals, but people who were essentially maybe stuck at home did take the time to really step back, maybe did have the time to possibly focus on self-care, all the things. And so, but what ended up happening is, when COVID essentially lifted or when things started to kind of go back to work, I think what we're dealing with now, or maybe what we're seeing at the WDC and through the state is, now, these good job principles are coming out of what employers can do around family sustaining wages and upward mobility and what you can really do to really have that worker well-being mindset for your employees. And so anyways, I say that just to say I really appreciate this because to me this is saying you can do all the personal development you want and all the self-care activities you want, but if, to your point, James, if you don't have a community to fall back on, or if you do work in a toxic organization, you know, a lot of times you might not want to then maybe work on your personal, you know, your self-care in a sense, or, you know, or vice versa. And so, so I think it's just, this is a really good holistic, I guess, visual for me. And I think from an industry perspective, I think it's good to just kind of look at that and say, huh, is there ways to go beyond maybe just an FSA account, right? Because I think sometimes the onus is often put on, when maybe that's what goes back to that stigma where, you know, the onus is put on the individual to just figure it out. You know, it's like, well, you're dealing with this, you just need to figure it out, instead of having this unified, holistic, I guess, approach. But it is kind of that, to your point, Liz and Dan, I think whoever mentioned it about, you know, boundaries, and, you know, there is a line, right? Because we, you know, you can't be their counselor. And so anyways, I just wanted to add that. But I just like this visual, and but yeah, it's almost like they're interchangeable, but you kind of can't really have one without the other in the same way.
So building resilience, I think that's a really great concept, right? For people to build resilience through these different areas. And I think, you know, it's once again, it's what are their support foundations in their community, their family, their relationships, their friends. I mean, all those things come into play with that. Moving on a little bit to the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. And these are 6 different ways that we can approach trauma. And there's some good examples, and we'll go over all the examples here, but you can see the list here, and we'll kind of go down a little bit for each. You know, in safety, you know, do the staff feel safe to talk with their managers about difficult personal situations that may affect their work? And that's that fine line, I think, that Keith was bringing up so well, in that, you know, if you inform me about something that's going on and how it's going to impact your work, that's something for us to work through. But if you start kind of telling me as if I'm your counselor and you want me to just listen, that's a different professional that needs to come in for that support. And it's interesting, right? Because if you start listening to that part, it's how do you start kind of delineating what is appropriate and what's maybe something that needs professional counseling. So but in all these parts here, when we think about those approaches, it's helping the person feel safe, you know, at a basic level. So if they feel like they're being bullied, or they feel like they're being, you know, picked on or something, it's just, how can we kind of take a step back and once again support that safety feeling with that. And so as I'm bringing up those examples, if you have an example, please feel free to bring them up as well. And you know, one of my questions would be, what helps you feel safe at work? I know, you know, sometimes there's a stress of meetings or something as a deadline, and sometimes to me there's that anxiety of trying to meet that deadline, and sometimes it all comes to like the last minute before, and so those things are stressful to me. But I think for me, what makes me feel safe is when I know I have the support of leadership, and and when they verbally kind of, you know, say that support, that's when I feel safer, knowing that we're all on the same page, we're all informed. And so then I don't feel like I'm not an outlier, so to speak. Does anyone else have an example of what makes you feel safe at work, or safe in general? You know, just with I'm thinking more an organizational lens, but could be at any level, either that community, that personal, that organizational.
I think a great way, and I think a great harmless, easy to implement way to demonstrate safety is for leaders in an organization to overtly and openly mention and acknowledge when they've made a mistake. Regardless of how high the stakes are, I've been in experiences, work environments where a mistake with the lowest of stakes, leaders will bend over backwards to keep from admitting the obvious thing. And that sort of reverberates through the culture of the organization. If you can articulate in a firm, believable way that you're taking ownership for a mistake that everyone knows you've made, then what's the expectation of how people are supposed to govern themselves or advance accountability when it's time to do that? And so if we don't see that demonstrated within the ranks of our leadership, I don't see how we can develop safety. I don't see how we can develop trust. I don't see how we can lean into peer support.
Thank you, Keith. You highlighted transparency, which was highlighted in one of the areas as organization, and building that resiliency. So having that increased transparency. And you said, the leader obviously owns the mistake and identifies it in truthfulness. Yeah, no, thank you. I agree with that. And so I'm just gonna, Herman put a question into the group chat. Do managers have the training to have those conversations? And the conversations around which part, Herman? I just wanted to identify that.
It's around the safety part where you talk about, do staff feel safe to talk with their managers, right? Are there managers in a place, knowledge-wise, experience-wise, that type of thing, to have those conversations effectively? So that's what I'm referring to.
Okay. Does anyone get any training on this area to have conversations with staff? I see, Keith, I saw your eyebrows raise up, but I was like, whoa. Oh, Liz, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think part of that also has to say is, I mean, you could do an entire degree around trauma-informed management. So I think it's also, what are the expectations of the managers as it relates to this? Excuse me, which would then inform what kind of training do they need in order to be, a lot of it is just a comfort situation. I mean, for a manager to talk about personal things with employees, that can be difficult for them. So in some ways, I think it gets back to that boundary thing.
Thank you. On to trust and transparency. Looking at trust and transparency, and I think, we were highlighting that having transparency is going to build trust. And so this was an interesting, but share important information multiple times in various formats. And once again, we know communication, is all different for everybody. Where we get our information from, depends widely on how it's shared. So that's another part that's going to give a good example is trust and transparency, is having that in multiple formats in multiple ways and times. And then here you go, Keith, is leadership transparent about their self and collective care and modeling it? So are they being transparent with their own struggles and kind of, and not necessarily going deep. I don't think as a leader going so deep and, kind of talking about some of that depressive stuff, but really how are you managing that self-care and modeling that self-care? Any more ideas of trust and transparency? Yeah, go ahead.
That second bullet, share important information multiple times in various formats. One thing that was sort of like an evolution for me was I grew up in an environment where you were only told to do things once. And if it were repeated, that was interpreted as you misbehaving or not wanting to do what the authority figure said to you. It took a lot of years to unlearn that because different people learn in different ways. Some people learn by watching. Some people learn by having as much perfect information as possible up front so they can digest it, so they can make sense of it, and then they can come to a meeting or whatever prepared. Other people need to ride shotgun. No amount of pretext, no amount of information beforehand will resonate. They need to ride shotgun with someone and see whatever they're being asked to do, see it sort of modeled by someone else. So I think share important information multiple times in various formats. I embrace that a lot more nowadays because just because I'm asking you to do something and I think I'm being clear on how I'm doing it doesn't mean that it's being received. And it's my job as someone's supervisor to ensure that they have the materials, the resources, and all related items to do the best job that they can. And so I think sometimes the request to share important information multiple times in various formats, it can be misconstrued as disorganization, or it can be misconstrued as people not being invested in the job and wanting to do the work, and just sort of being mindful of that.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, Dan.
So this morning I had an opportunity to do a brief presentation on kind of collaboration practice and collaboration science at the Health Workforce Roundtable in Walla Walla, and working with Career Connect Washington and skill centers and ESDs and a couple of community colleges and some important industry partners. Anyways, I was able to share a graphic called the collaboration spectrum or collaboration continuum, and they talk a lot about turf versus trust, and which is interesting because it's the more we try to protect our own turf, or the less likely we are to engage in real good collaborative practice. And so, and the reverse is true as well. The more we increase our ability to trust others, rely on others, and increase our communication, support one another in different projects, then our levels of trust go up. Anyways, it's a really interesting continuum. I'd be happy to share that with you. But I think it speaks to this. And I love the fact that Keith highlighted this in terms of sharing information multiple ways in different formats. I think is so crucial.
I'd be
Thank you,
interested
Dan.
in that, Dan, actually, for my class, because we will be talking about turf battles as it relates to silos and how those interfere with interprofessional collaboration.
Yeah, I'm actually talking about that at our conference, which is going on this week and next week for the National Center for Interprofessional Practice and Education. So I will be speaking to that that continuum and those tensions that we all experience around collaborative practice. I'll be happy to share that with you, Liz.
I'd appreciate that. Unfortunately, it's a completely online class. Otherwise, I'd say you could come on a Zoom and talk to them, but we're not doing any Zooms.
Yeah, Dan, if you want to send that to me, I can include it in the calendar invitation or send it out to the HILT, put it in our LinkedIn group if you have that available. That'd be great.
Sure.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'd like to learn more. I mean, I in my head, I'm thinking a lunch and learn. That's how I think so. Yeah, I just wanted to refer to Angie Gray's comment regarding Herman's question about managers have the training to have those conversations. Angie writes, this is always such a challenge and such a relevant question that we need to continue to ask to make sure that resources are allocated. So obviously putting all that funds and technical training to work. So many successful ICs are promoted to leadership without getting the training they need to be successful leaders. So if people don't have these trauma experiences, then how do they learn about them if they're not given the training and involved in the conversation or any of that? So thank you, Angie. And then peer support, right? When we're looking at these are once again, principles of a trauma-informed approach. So when you look at peer support, obviously including self-care, you saw that in the presentation, giving people that leverage to have that if they need it. And then this was, so process collective traumas. So this was just kind of that peer support, having people kind of have access to that and something that they can do as well on their own. Looking at the next three, collaboration and mutuality. Gratitude icebreaker, we started with that. That's a great thing we did, and that's a good example. Structure more work into teams versus individual contribution. So there's that kind of team approach rather than people being identified individually and kind of called out, if you will. Any other examples of collaboration and mutuality? And Abby, I was looking at your comment here. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to come off of mute?
Sure, yeah, I was just adding on to kind of what Herman was saying. I think just the whole trauma-informed care, and we're kind of seeing that in the construction industry. And I know this is more of the healthcare space, but I only made that connection because construction has the highest rate for suicides. I just think because it's a very lonely job. probably various other reasons, dangerous, all these other things. And so we're just noticing just through these apprenticeships, and these are amazing opportunities, earn while you learn, nationally recognized credentials, but there's just a huge gap when it comes to actually having people complete the training. And, from what we've heard, the people who are training these apprentices are wanting to learn. They want to be these leaders. I just think it's this maybe mix of, old boy, old school kind of, this apprentice was taught by this apprentice, you kind of just learn as you go type of mentality, rough and tumble. And so anyways, I just kind of put that in the comment, but essentially I just kind of was adding to it that to what Angie was kind of saying, and Herman, of it is kind of going across sectors essentially is what we're seeing. And especially in the construction industry, and a lot of employers that are a part of these apprenticeships, while they pay into it and they pay into this union training fund, they often don't know how those training funds are being spent, right? Because the union kind of oversees what trainings are being done for the apprentices. And oftentimes it is spent on, tools and, things like that, more of like the day-to-day stuff. And it's not really spent on, maybe leadership type trainings, or how to scale up maybe a lead, or a foreman, or things like that. And so maybe that's done internally, but it's not so formalized to kind of maybe what we're talking about here today. And so it is kind of just an important topic that we're kind of just obviously seeing across sectors, but just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think of an industry that has a high suicide rate. Man,
Yeah.
that's just it's kind of a little bit mind-blowing in that sense.
Mhm.
James, I just
Yeah.
wanted to again reiterate that, and I kind of feel bad about following what Abby was just talking about, because it is such a important topic of, and I actually, didn't realize the significance of that. But going back to this issue of collaboration and kind of defining mutual benefit amongst partners, I think that's so important. And I think we don't understand the science of partnership development and collaboration as much as we should when we begin the process of innovation, initiative building, doing strategic partnerships. There's a whole science to it. And I think I gave an example this morning, that I was at a meeting a number of years ago, and they were talking about one of our current initiatives. I won't say it. And they were a person who is still in our system says, "Oh, we're going to partner across the state." And I said, "Well," and I raised the question. I said, "Well, so what does that mean? What does partnering mean?" And she couldn't give an answer. That this person couldn't give an answer. It was just, "Well, we're just going to partner," and without really defining what that looks like. And I think we have to really visit the importance of building a practice around good collaboration. When we've done HEAT grants before, which is the Hospital Employee Education Training grants, with multiple colleges, including the one that Liz is involved with at Edmonds, we've trained people on collaborative practice, just be able to carry out some of the innovation work that we've done at colleges, so that we can work together with and among colleges and with and among our industry partners, because of those challenges around partnership. Anyways,
No, I really appreciate that. You're exactly right. It's not like they go, "Hey, James, go partner with Dan." I mean, what does that mean to partner with you? I mean, yeah, I think that's really something to unpack and identify, because I think we all have our own perspectives with that idea. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Dan, I just see lots of great conversations with, what the information you can present. Lots of good, useful stuff. Good. So we're going to move on a little bit. We've got 10 more minutes here in this discussion. So we've got empowerment, voice, and choice. Invite more often, require less often, allow greater flexibility, and how the work gets done. and then provide input and follow it. I mean, how many times do we provide input and nobody follows it, right? Or they ask for suggestions only to tell you what they wanted you to learn, know, or direction to go through. So, once again, I see this part about control, and it's the more we try to control people and give them the do this, do that, do this, do that, the less collaboration, the less teamwork environments that we're producing, and the less authority that they have and how that work gets done. So really trying to make that a little more fluid. Cultural humility and responsiveness. So here is how we're getting that information in multiple formats, multiple languages, celebrating diversity and acknowledging, the time for cultural trauma, and just, if you need to take a step back and slow down rather than rushing ahead. So these are all things that, we can look at it from a big perspective of these are all the best practices, and you're going to need to kind of reach in and use some of them when you need them most, rather than, always using all of them all the time. So I think, as people were pointing out, it's individualistic with the employees that you're with. But these are, ways to have a trauma-informed approach with individuals. Any more comments on any of these? These were part of that 6 examples. All right, healthy response to trauma. The first 3 are definitely something, if you're with somebody and there comes this trauma response, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or I can't think of the 4th one at the top of my head right now, but you're going to listen and assess for distress or harm. So you're obviously picking up those cues that we're looking at those examples, and you're identifying that that's where it might be coming from. You're going to affirm their experience, so not tell them like, hey, don't feel that, or that's not the way. You're going to want to kind of give them that leverage to what they're experiencing is real for them. Partner with them to navigate their care, if that's where it's going to go after that. And that care could be different things. It could be a 10-minute break. It could be a, hey, let's pick this up tomorrow. Or it could be, right now I'm not in the best headspace. I apologize. And that's going to take a little bit different skill, I think, from the person to acknowledge that. And then obviously, if you needed to involve professional help, you can initiate self-care and support plan, and then obviously get professional help with that as well. So how do people think is the best way to kind of do? I mean, here are the LAPIS response. What are some other good ways to respond? So an employee shows you, one of those areas: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. That kind of happens in a meeting. It could be, and it could be any one or all 4 in a given time. What are we going to do as a response? How do we do that? And I think this information here, once again, is, once again, we're going to listen and slow it down, and just, once again, create that safe environment, meaning any distracting stimulus kind of gets, maybe a door has to get closed, or, some privacy has to happen, so that now we're kind of calming the environment down.
I think the one affirm their experience. From my personal and professional experience, and I don't want to rank any of these, and I'm about to do it anyway. How about that? I think affirm their experience. I cannot overstate the importance of just sitting and listening and not taking it personally and not trying to immediately fix it. I think a lot of us are in situations where we enjoy fixing problems. That's my thing. You sit down, you listen to people, and then you're ready to just roll up your sleeves and get it done. Sometimes that's not required. Sometimes if you just sit and listen to folks and affirm what you're hearing and articulate to them what you're hearing them say, sometimes they can kind of talk themselves through a solution. The challenge for me is to pause and not try to fix it all the time. And maybe fixing it looks different than what I've been conditioned to believe how it looks. I want to go back to something that we mentioned a while back, and I think Liz brought it up, with the stigma of seeking help, or if you want to see a psychiatrist or a therapist or any sort of specialist. I think being a male, I'm speaking from my perspective, being a person who identifies as a man from the American Deep South, nowhere was it sort of, how can I word this? Nowhere was it made to be okay that I can admit that I'm sad or I'm struggling or I'm tired or I'm unsure. And I doubt that I'm the only person who identifies as a male in our country who feels that way. And so how can we get to affirming their experience and not be what we've conditioned to be, the fixer, the one that's resolute at all times, the one that's supposed to be on top of it? I think we can get there. And one of the ways of doing that is just sitting back and listening actively and affirming whatever it is people are articulating to you. Once they are able to get that out, they'll lower their guard, and then I think you can get closer to actually finding a solution. So that's all I wanted to add to that.
So you rank affirm their experiences first. I would agree. I think you're exactly right. I think that goes kind of with the listen and assess, kind of you're trying to figure out, and then obviously affirm their experience and don't tell them, oh, what, you don't know what you're thinking about, or you're all wrong. You're not going to do that, right? Just kind of take a step back and listen. Anything else from this sheet? Well, I think, we've had a really great discussion. I want to thank everybody for joining us today because this was really insightful. Thank you, everybody who contributed, shared your information, even some of your own story. Really important work for us to do, on this time as we spend so much time with talent acquisition and getting them in the door and all these programs and so forth. And once we have them there, how do we support them through this work? How do we support them? Because, they say that 66% of individuals have gone through a traumatic experience. So we're going to see it. And maybe you've seen it already, or you see it currently. It's there. And it's just what's the best way for us to deal with it as leaders? Because the goal is to keep people, right? And I will say it's what I know about appreciative inquiry and all the research that I've done is a lot of it is control. People, when you put people in a corner and you kind of stress them out, they just lash out, right? So it's just taking that step back, affirming what they're going through, and just talking in a calm voice, slowing your voice, kind of in that, and it's calming it all down, right? Because we look at that physiology, it goes very quick. And so just how do we slow that down for people to kind of do a good assessment with that? Yes. So Herman had a question. I will be sending out this slide deck here. Any final words from anyone here? Any last reflections? Okay, then class is over. It's like everyone's eager to get rid of class. So yeah, thank you everybody for being part of this. All the contributions, great input and suggestions on how we manage this as leaders. Have a great weekend, and we will see you at one of our next upcoming meetings. Thank you.
Thank you.